Elijah was a prophet, strong in word and deed, as they say. He was a cool dude. If you looked him up, if you found his biography, it would be pretty astounding. He raised people from the dead. He spoke intimately with God. He fought for the heart and soul of a nation. He alone was the prophet of God at a time when everybody was worshiping all of the other gods in the land. And his voice was so prominent that it spoke for all ages ever since then. Ever since Elijah, he was so powerful that he was one of two people in Scripture who was simply taken from the earth. He never died. Jesus died and came back to life. Elijah was just taken in a chariot of fire, straight into heaven. And ever since that moment, the Jews to this day, in their Seder meal and the Passover meal, still leave a chair open and a door open for Elijah to come and to sit at their meal. We're still looking for Elijah today. He was such a big deal, powerful, awesome prophet. And yet, 1 Kings chapter 19. In 1 Kings chapter 19, we see a different side of Elijah, one that we don't see very often, if ever at all. In the midst of all of this cool dude stuff, this Rambo of prophecy sort of thing, the guy that everybody looked to at the time, and ever since then, as this powerful leader, as this individual who speaks to God and for God, we see a glimpse of something terrible happening in his life. 1 Kings chapter 19, starting at verse 3. Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. This powerful guy, this prophet who is the guy for God, was afraid and fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. Then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died." We're going to pause there, because there's two ways to read this as a context. And this morning we're approaching it more from a broad scope of things. That this is who Elijah was. He was a big deal. He was powerful. And he knew it. He knew that he had the power of God behind him. And he had this boldness about him that he was ready to take on any and everything at his command, at whatever was in front of him. He was ready to go and to do whatever God said, go and do. And here we see, when one person threatens to take his life, something about this one time triggers it. And suddenly he's afraid. And he's not just afraid, but he flees for his life. And he's not just afraid and flees for his life, he's depressed. And he's down. And he goes off all by himself. And he goes off into the wilderness to die. He says, "Get away from me. Everybody that I love, everybody that I know, I just don't want to deal with this anymore." He doesn't even say that he failed. He just simply says that he's afraid. Actually, he does say that he's failed. He's no better than his ancestors. And he just wants to die. Well, we know the end of the story, like I already said. He's not going to die. He's not ever going to die. He's just going to get taken up into heaven one day. But right now, he's sitting there under a tree saying, "I can't do it anymore. Just take me now. I'm terrified. I feel like I've failed. This is a terrible circumstance. Everything's gone haywire on me. And I can't do this anymore." As he laid there, then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came again and touched him and said, "Get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you." So he got up, ate, and drank. And the food gave him enough strength to travel 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. Your translation is going to say Horeb, but it's the same thing. It's interchangeable, more or less. There he came to a cave where he spent the night. So this is our 40 days, our 40 nights. This is the last of this series on 40 days and 40 nights. Next Sunday we're going to move into something brand new entirely. But this week we finish it all up. And we finish it up with possibly the best example of what 40 days and 40 nights or 40 years or whatever the 40 period of time span is in our lives. As we're going through Lent, this is such a perfect example of what that 40 days and 40 nights is all about. Because Elijah, this powerful prophet, this guy who has fought for souls, who has brought people to life, who has performed miracles and done just amazing things, is in a bad place. And he's lost, and he doesn't know what's going on anymore. And he just wants to be lost, and he just wants to go off and to die alone. And yet, God comes to him in the midst of this, and God ministers to him. And he bakes him bread, and he gives him water, and he tells him what he should do. He gives him encouragement and says, "You've got this journey to go on, and I'm going to come alongside you, and I'm going to help you. I'm going to give you strength. I'm going to minister to you, and we're going to go through this together." And isn't that just what it's like in our lives? Isn't that just what we need? In these 40 days and 40 nights, in any period of time, we're going through the week. Usually, it's Wednesday, that hump day, we've just got to get over it. Or Monday, and we've got to get back into the swing of things. Or we're coming back from summer break. Whatever it is, at any given moment in time, it doesn't have to be a 40 days and 40 nights kind of a thing. We hit those walls. Or we feel like everything's going right and everything's going really well and everything's going good, and suddenly, for whatever reason, something breaks and everything flies out of control. Everything spins off into chaos. And here we are in the middle of it, and everything's falling apart, and we just don't know what to do. And we say, "I just want to curl up in bed and sleep it off. I just want to go off and I want to be alone. I don't want anything. I don't want to be around anything. I don't want to do any more work. I don't want to be around any more people. I just want to go off, and I'm no better than anybody else because it all fell apart, and here I am, solitary, singly, all by myself, and everything's messed up, and I can't handle it anymore." And we have those times. And this time brings Elijah to the cave, where God comes to him. But the Lord said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" We'll come back to that later. Elijah replied, "I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you. They've torn down your altars and killed every one of your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. Go out and stand before me on the mountain," the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went burst out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And that's where we're stopping right now. Because more chaos, more craziness. And this is totally overwhelming, right? This is what we feel like when everything's falling apart. There's earthquakes, there's wind, there's fire, and there's all this terrible stuff going on, and we don't know what's happening. And there's chaos. And in the middle of it, are we listening for that silence? Are we listening for that still small whisper? Because that's how God comes. The last time we saw this happen, it was God in the wind. It was God as the earthquake. It was God as the fire. Are we ready for God to manifest Himself in a different way in our lives? Or are we only ever always looking for those big deal, huge mountaintop experiences? Yes, God heals. Yes, God does amazing things. And sometimes He chooses not to heal. Sometimes we have to learn from the grief and the mourning. Sometimes we have to learn from loss. And those miracles that we love to talk about and that are amazing to happen, sometimes those aren't going to happen. And that doesn't mean that God is not there. God is there in the miracles. God is there in the wind and the fire and the earthquake. And God is there in our fear and our terror and our loss and our heartbreak. In the silence, God is there. In the midst of chaos, God is there. And everywhere along the journey, God is there. He comes alongside Elijah and He ministers to him. He nourishes him. He serves him. He gives him all of the physical well-being that he's going to need to get through these 40 days and 40 nights. He gives him the correct vision, the great ideas to come and to go and to do the things that he's supposed to be doing. And He gives them the safety and the security and the awareness to recognize where He is when He is there. To know that God is there when He's baking the bread and pouring the water. To know that God is there as He's leading him to Mount Sinai. To know that God is there sometimes in the wind and the rain and the storm and the fire. And to know that sometimes God is there when there's silence. And there's just a little whisper happening. That God is always there, no matter what. And yet we hit those times in our life, don't we? We hit those times where we experience loss. Where we experience very poor health, where we just don't know what's going to happen, where we experience financial distress to the extent that we don't know if we're going to be able to pay off the car or it's going to get taken from us. That we don't know what's going to happen in our life because everything's spinning out of control. We feel like we've been doing a good job. We feel like we've been following God, and yet still these things happen, don't they? Still, we fall and we stumble and we fail. Still, we feel fear and terror at the job that is ahead of us to do. And sometimes we find ourselves in this place not simply after loss, not simply after getting beat down in the battle. Sometimes we experience this after a victory. Because let's not forget, that's what the immediate context of where Elijah's coming from. Elijah's coming off a massive victory at Mount Carmel, where he showed an entire nation that God is God, and God is powerful, and God is in charge of everything. And after this victory, Elijah still feels fear. It's exactly the same as the Israelites on the doorstep of the Promised Land last week. It's exactly the same in those other times in those 40 days where we're experiencing this spiritual high, this amazing moment. And then we come to this point where we stop. And we have to reevaluate, and we have to reassess. And we have to say, are we on the right track? Are we really still focused on God? because Elijah experienced a victory. He was obviously doing the things that he was supposed to do. The Israelites were on the doorstep of the promised land. They were exactly where they were supposed to be, and victory was given to them. All they had to do was take it. All he had to do was run with it and move on and go on to those bigger, greater things. And yet, fear grabs a hold of us. Terror overwhelms us. Those things, those doubts, those self-doubts, those doubts of God sometimes get in us and grab us and control us and keep us from going on. And yet, God is there. And He ministers to us in the midst of that. He ministers to us in the low points. Yes, our God is a great, big, huge God that created the heavens and the earth and the universe and all that we see. But our God is also a small God who in the midst of all those great, big, huge things is whispering to us and saying, "Come and find me. I'm right here. And I want to talk with you." And before we move on, before we go a whole lot further, we're going to stop right there. Because what I kept wanting to do, what I kept trying to do, was to pull Psalm 46 into this and talk about be still and know that I am God. And obviously I did it anyway, just there. But in the midst of that, in the midst of connecting all of that, as I was reading it and as I was praying through it and struggling through it, I also had this realization that that's not quite what this context is. That the be still and know that He is God is such a military thing. It's such a fighting kind of a thing. That's not where Elijah is right now. Where Elijah is in all those other parts in the Psalm. Because there's this word that shows up all throughout the Psalms. Selah. And anybody who's a musician, especially guitar players, know that Selah has to be the guitar solo part. It has to be that part in the middle of the song in Freebird where everything's going and you've got this long, huge space, right? And the idea of this Selah in the middle of these psalms is for the music to keep on playing, for things to keep on going, but for us to take a break. For us to stop and to let all of that just wash over us. To let all of that sink in and take a hold of us. So I want to take a moment in the middle of this sermon, because there's not as much left as you might think. In the middle of this message, and give you the chance to let all of that really sink in. Where do you find yourself this morning? Where is the fear in your life? Last week we talked about the rocks, and I told you to go out and to find those people who are crying out in the desert and to give them those rocks and to invite them to grab a hold of their hand and to start to pull them with you, because Christ has saved them and it's our job to help them find that salvation. And that's overwhelming. That's terrifying. And just like the Israelites were right there ready to build the kingdom of God, here we are, right here, ready to take that message out. And it can be scary. Or maybe we find ourselves going out into the workplace and maybe starting to, but there's that persecution that's going to happen as soon as we open our mouth. And when we try to open our mouth and talk about God in our lives, maybe we're afraid of getting slammed down. Just like Elijah is afraid of being killed by this queen. We fear for our lives. We fear for our well-beings, for our relationships. We fear for our reputations. Maybe it's none of that. Maybe you genuinely feel beat down by life itself. Maybe the car keeps breaking down. Maybe groceries are as thin as they could possibly be. Maybe those people in your life are struggling to hold their relationships together. Maybe you're struggling to hold your relationships together. Where is the brokenness? What is the sin that you're struggling with in your life? What is the thing that's keeping you from God? Take this moment. take this time and realize God is right there in the midst of all of it. That He's right there to minister to you, to find you, to help you on this journey as you're going. That He's right there when there's noise all around you and you can't seem to find Him or hear Him or know who He is or what He's doing in your life, because you can't feel God there. He's still there, and He's whispering to you. And ironically enough, the song that I'm going to sing is, it's an old hymn, and it's by a pastor named Elisha. Who had gone out on visitation with somebody from the church, and she was struggling with these things, and she was struggling with her sin, and the things in her life that were keeping her from God. And she was in this place with Elijah, and she couldn't figure out. And finally, as he's talking to her, as he's praying through it, she says, I must tell Jesus. Just like Elijah knew that he had to seek out God, she knew that she had to seek out Jesus. And where are you in that 40 days? Where do you feel you are in this time? Wherever you are, seek out Jesus in the midst of it. Maybe you're coming off of victory and you feel like you can conquer the world. Maybe there's chaos all around and you feel like you can't get your bearings. Maybe you're being beat down everywhere you turn. Take a moment. Selah. Let it sink in. Know that Jesus is right here with you to help you get through this. Invite you to not to just stay where you are. Elijah had to take that journey. Elijah had to take that trip. I made sure that the prayer beams, altars are here. Come forward and leave those things.